Audio or video footage used in this video is owned entirely by the copyright holders. Horrific FX makes no claim of ownership and is simply using the footage for purposes of education, commentary, and criticism under fair use. Hello and welcome to a brand new list of Horrific FX's Top 13 Countdown series. As any of you who've checked out this channel before know, every month we try to do a new presentation of a Top 13 Countdown. And for this edition, we are doing our Top 13 horror films that changed the genre. Now, just want to, before we get into the presentation, let you know that there possibly will be spoilers, so if you're worried about that, you might want to skip through this presentation and come back another time. But if that doesn't bother you, then please feel free to keep checking out this video. On this video, we're going to be presenting top 13 horror films that have been an influence in the genre. Whether it's been box office appeal, social media coverage, the filming style, and so forth. Now, there are several films that very easily could be on this presentation that were left out. So I apologize to anyone who are fans of those films. This is just my own personal view and my own personal feelings about influential horror films. So with that being said, let's get on with the countdown and start with number 13. Number 13, The Shining, 1980. Now, this film is well noted as being a film that, even though the novel was written by Stephen King, he was very much let's just say, not too fond of the film, which was directed by Stanley Kubrick. However, you cannot deny its impact in the horror genre. It was a film that gave almost beauty and such stylish directing to the film, not to mention one of the most scary films ever made in history. Every Halloween, no doubt, you can read some newspaper article or magazine article or some special naming the top 10 horror films in history, and Shining will be in there. And its influence, just the paranormal aspect of the film, and again, just the artistic directing of Stanley Kubrick, from the look of the hotel to the blood coming from the elevator to the eeriness of the twins, to Danny riding his bike and the sound from going from the rug to the hardwood floor to the carpeting and so forth. So just a very well put together film, highly influential for many reasons, but for me mostly, I think the artistic point of view. Again, so many beautiful scenes, even the outside of the Overlook Hotel, the snow maze, and the end of the film when Danny's being chased by Jack Nicholson's character, and the snow and the blues in there. Such a well put together artistic film. Number 12, The Silence of the Lambs. Now, this was one I was debating upon because there were some others like Nosferatu and so forth I was thinking of putting in here. But I decided to go with Silence of the Lambs for the main reason that its overall appeal after the release. You never see a horror movie in the Academy Awards, and not only did this movie get nominated for Academy Awards, but won every major Academy Award. Best Adapted Screenplay, Best Writer, Best Director, Best Actress, Best Actor, Best Film, sweeping all of the major awards. And this coming from a film that was released on Valentine's Day far, far away from the normal release date for an Oscar-worthy film, which is always in December or near the end of the year. And still this film, which was such a violent, almost of a downer of a film, getting all these awards was phenomenal. And all the word of mouth from this film and the buzz about the film, which paved the way for other films, kind of like recently released Get Out a couple years ago, and how that was nominated for Academy Awards. All those kind of movies owe a lot to The Silence of the Lambs, which really helped pave the way and was a huge influence. Number 11, Dracula, 1931. Now, this was one that was hard to kind of put for just one film. I did for Dracula because it was actually released first, but you very easily could put Dracula and Frankenstein in this category, in this slot in the countdown. Both films came out in 1931. Dracula was the one that actually was released first. But Dracula and Frankenstein really helped bolster Universal and the Universal monster craze. In the coming years following Dracula and Frankenstein, you had the Mummy, the Wolfman, the Creature from the Black Lagoon, and so many more films, which really helped kickstart Universal and that whole monster craze back then, which helped lead to such iconic films that were made decades later. That you talk to the writer or director and they say that Dracula and Frankenstein were their influences. So for that part, we have to put Dracula and Frankenstein, but I just put Dracula since it was the film released first. Number 10, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Now, this is a German film which is hailed by many as the first true horror film. Obviously, there were films before it, even like the original silent version of Frankenstein, but this was considered by many as the first true horror film. And it was such a stylish film, which had some creep factor and a very good story and characters. And if you go back and watch it now, you can definitely see where films are influenced by it now, in particular Tim Burton films. You can watch Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and you'd swear it was a Tim Burton film back then. And just a visual treat. This was, of course, a silent film. But again, just anyone who has seen the film, if you see a picture from the film, you know what it is. It was so stylish and really helped push horror in that time frame. Number 9, The Bride of Frankenstein. Now, this kind of plays off the whole Dracula and Frankenstein I mentioned earlier in this presentation. But what was so revolutionary about this was it was one of the first true sequels in horror films. And not only that, but it was not only one of the first true sequels to a horror film, it was, in many people's eyes, superior to the original film. The fact that you had the monster talking and introduced that great character of the bride, and great story, a fun film to watch, and really helped aid Dracula and Frankenstein, and of course the Wolfman, the Mummy, in that Universal monster craze, that boom back in the day. Number 8, King Kong, 1933. Now, many films back in the day have the honor of being called a highly influential film, King Kong is one of the most influential films. For its time, it was revolutionary, the work that they were able to do on that film, for which paved the way for so many people, for so many films nowadays. I think of the Harryhauser films. You think of Nightmare on Elm Street 3, obviously Army of Darkness, and so forth like that, with a lot of stop motion films in the horror genre. And King Kong really was such an influence. And this is one of the films that so many people that you interview that are in the horror genre will say King Kong is what influenced them and got them started. And go back to interviews with like the K&B FX crew saying they remember reading Famous Monsters of Filmland magazine. In addition to Dracula and Frankenstein and Wolfman, you had King Kong. And just the great filming of that film. It was just revolutionary for its time. Number 7, Night of the Living Dead, 1968. Now, this film has the prestige of being the original zombie classic. You can see where it's kind of loosely based off of Carnival of Souls, but this is the zombie film you think of when you say what started the zombie craze. George Romero's classic story, which also had an influential kind of story as opposed to just the horror film of it, the impact it had on the surrounding world at the time between Vietnam and racial injustices and so forth, which is played out in the film. But just the fact that nowadays you have shows like The Walking Dead, Z Nation, you have film comedies, Shaun of the Dead, Zombieland, you have the other Dead films, Return of the Living Dead, World War Z, 28 Days Later, so many films. And the zombie genre as part of the horror genre was such an influence, and was influenced by this classic film, Night of the Living Dead. Number 6, Psycho, 1960. Now, this Alfred Hitchcock classic is considered by many the granddaddy of them all, the first true slasher film. And what was such an influence about this was so many different aspects of the filming and scenes and shooting. But I think most people will say the biggest influence of it was the creativity of Alfred Hitchcock to kill off a main character so early in the film. The film revolves around this character who you follow, you go through her whole story, and then partway through the film, bam, she's killed in that legendary shower scene. Janet Leigh, who was such a great actress, especially in that scene, everything that Alfred Hitchcock put her through. But you followed her character, and you had a love for that character. And then, like I said, bam, she's killed off. You don't know what's going to happen now. You don't feel safe if that character can get killed off partway through the film. And it was just such a good roller coaster of a ride that Alfred Hitchcock took you through. Like I said, you're following Janet Leigh, and now all of a sudden she's dead, and now you're following Norman Bates, who was portrayed brilliantly by Anthony Perkins. But again, so influential on that alone, which later influenced other films, in particular Halloween, which even named a character, the Dr. Sam Loomis character, off of Janet Leigh's boyfriend in Psycho, the same character name, Sam Loomis. Number 5, Jaws. Now, if you've watched any of my previous videos, I've never been shy about naming the fact I'm not a huge fan of Jaws. I've just never been a huge fan of water horror movies. But Jaws has a huge influential aspect in the horror genre. You had a whole generation of people who saw that film and were terrified to go out into the water for the coming summers. And just the fact that you had such a good horror movie where the killer was a monster, was not just a monster, but an animal. You had films like King Kong, you had Godzilla and all that, but you don't see a huge gorilla running loose in New York. You don't see a giant Godzilla-like monster tearing apart Tokyo. You can go swimming in the ocean and have a shark there. So that was such a huge influence. And so many other aspects of the film. The musical score, so legendary, which I covered in another video of the top 13 horror movie theme songs. So many aspects of that film, so influential. Number 4, Halloween, 1978. Now, Halloween is undoubtedly my all-time favorite horror movie. I love the character of Michael Myers. John Carpenter is one of my favorite directors. I love the story of Halloween, the theme of it. And this film is so influential, particularly for a person like me, my favorite subgenre of the horror genre is 80s slasher films and slasher films in general. And Halloween is what kickstarted that. There were other films before Halloween that are slashers. Of course, Psycho, as I mentioned before, Black Christmas, Texas Chainsaw Massacre. But Halloween is really what kickstarted the slasher craze. After Halloween came out and was so successful, you had so many other films that admittedly copied Halloween. You had Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, Prom Night, Graduation Day. Even to the point that when they made Graduation Day, they said they watched Halloween. They had a stopwatch, and counted down when the scares happened and weave those into their story. And the whole horror movies taking place on a holiday between My Bloody Valentine, April Fool's Day, and so on and so forth. Silent Night, Deadly Night. And this all kickstarted with Halloween. The simple idea of a killer walking around in a mask, slashing teenagers. And that all was started from the original 1978 Halloween, directed by John Carpenter. Number 3, The Blair Witch Project. Now, this is a film where it's either you love it or hate it. And there are a lot of people who don't appreciate the film and aren't fans of the film. But those of you who aren't, you still can't deny its impact on the horror genre. Kind of like Halloween, where it wasn't the original slasher, but it's the film that gets credited for kickstarting the slasher craze. The Blair Witch Project was not the very first found footage film, but it's the film that kickstarted the found footage craze. There were other films such as Cannibal Holocaust, The Last Broadcast. The Blair Witch Project is what really brought the found footage film mainstream. Films like VHS, Paranormal Activity, Cloverfield, just to name a few, that were influenced by the Blair Witch Project. And not only the found footage aspect of the film, but for the first time you had a film that was largely, and I mean largely, marketed through the internet. Again, this film was released in 1999, and the internet was just starting to become big, and its marketing is the stuff of legend in films, in the film genre, in the film history. How they marketed this film through the internet was phenomenal. And that and the found footage aspect, both those things coupled together, is what made the Blair Witch Project such a huge impact and so influential. And also, it can't be taken lightly the fact that going into the film, it was not known if this was a film or if it was the true happenings, true events, true life happenings that occurred. And that really played a part into the fact of, was this film true or not, and why it became such an influential film in the history of the horror genre. Number 2, Scream. Now, while Halloween started the slasher craze, by the mid to late 90s, the slasher craze was finally dying out. There weren't that many great horror films of the 90s. You had Silence of the Lambs, you had Candyman, and so forth like that. But the slasher craze was pretty much dead. And then came Scream and pow, kicked the doors open for the slasher craze and inspired other films like I Know What You Did Last Summer, Urban Legend, and so on and so forth. Again, similar plot. You had a mass killer slashing teens, but what was so influential about this was the fact that it broke that fourth wall. It mentioned other films like Halloween and Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street and Psycho and Evil Dead and so on and so forth. So many films that were named in that film, and paved the way, like not only just films like I mentioned, like Urban Legend and I Know What You Did Last Summer, but a recent film like Cabin in the Woods, where again it mentions that, it breaks that down, that fourth wall of these are films, this is what happens in films, and was so influential from that aspect. Number 1, The Exorcist. Now, this film cannot be understated, its place in the horror genre, just for so many different reasons. One, its cultural impact. There were people when that film was released, and keep in mind, this was a film released the day after Christmas and became a phenomenon. People were lined up the day after Christmas around blocks for miles to get in to see this movie. People were fainting. People didn't know what they were seeing on the screen. Not just the cultural impact, but then the special effects makeup. Of course, I mentioned on several of my videos how I'm a special effects makeup artist, professional artist who is also a professional makeup teacher. And this is a film I always tell my students about when we start beginning of a course. The legendary work that Dick Smith did on that film, and not just special effects makeup wise, but stuff like how they refrigerated the set to get that cold breath going in the scenes, and such an impact from the characters to the dialect to everything about this movie. It was such a cultural phenomenon, and undoubtedly, if you ask anyone to name the top horror movies of all time, almost everyone is going to put this as the number 1 horror film in history. So it definitely has its place as being a cultural phenomenon and a horror film that changed the genre for sure. And that will wrap up this presentation for Horrific FX's top 13 horror films that changed the genre. Again, this was my own personal list. I'm sure if you did a list of this under this category, your list would be a little different. But this was my own personal feelings and belief. There were so many films that were left off that could easily be in this list. So if you enjoyed this video, please feel free to subscribe and check out all of our previous top 13 countdown videos and other videos that we have on this Horrific FX channel. And if you enjoy it, please feel free to let me know if your thoughts about the content. And feel free to check out my website at horrificfx.com. And on that website, we have you can check out our prices and be able to book us for makeup sessions. And we have an online store there with props, prosthetics, fake bloods, and so on and so forth. And be sure to check us out on social media. Just search for Horrific FX. So again, have a good one, and don't forget to check out horrificfx.com.